Section 9. Chapter 5. Explanation of the Observations, Part 3. Now a few words on the manner in which horses react upon the call of their names. We are not concerned with those that are seldom or never called by name, such as those in the cavalry. I have not discovered one horse that constantly and unequivocally reacted upon the mention of its name, though I would not assert that there are none that would do so. I was nearly always able to convince the owners or grooms, who at first had maintained a contrary opinion, that any inarticulate sound was capable of producing the same effect as the calling of the name. What the significance of inflection may be, I am not at all certain. When a certain one of a number of horses standing in the same stable was called, all of them responded by pricking their ears, raising their heads, or else turning about. For this reason, the reaction of the horse specifically called lost all significance. Likewise, the call which is ordinarily used in lunging, when the man in the centre of the circle wishes the horse to change its gait, or to advance toward him, also proved ineffectual as soon as the man inhibited every sort of movement. A slight nod, on the other hand, was always effective. Several times I have tried to call horses to me, when they were free and running about in the arena, but was unsuccessful. After I had given them some sugar, however, they would always come to me, whether I had called or not, and would then refuse to leave my side, but this is a matter of common observation. I would, however, regard all of these tests as merely provisional. In spite of the greatest effort, it was not always possible to control all the conditions of the experiment, and furthermore, the number of tests would have to be materially increased in order to yield an appreciation of the difference due to race, age, and the individual variation and training of horses. But we may even now be sure of one thing. Over against the certainty with which horses react to visual stimuli, in the form of movements perceived, it does not appear that the formation of auditory associations is greatly favoured by nature in these animals. Indeed, auditory associations are far less common than is generally supposed. Footnotes. All of the authors who have given practical suggestions for the training of horses, whether free or with lunging reins, have great faith in the efficacy of calls, but usually recommend a mingling of calls and movements in the way of signs. Thus, Loiset, Boucher, von Armin. It therefore cannot be stated just in how far the calls really affect anything. In other cases I am inclined to doubt outright the influence which is ascribed to the auditory signs. Meehan gives an account of a horse that was exhibited in London in the early 90s of the last century. Pawing with his hoof, this horse apparently was able to count and answer questions in arithmetic, and among other accomplishments he was supposed to be able to understand something of language. In reality, however, he merely responded to cues which were disclosed to the reporter by the trainer. In pawing, the horse was guided by movements of the trainer, and in nodding or shaking the head he reputedly got his cue from the inflections of the man's voice. Is it not probable that in this latter case it was the movements which accompanied speech that were alone effective in inducing the nod or the shake of the head, so that the exhibitor was deceiving not merely the public but also himself? Perhaps we may also doubt the exposition made by the well-known hippologist Colonel Spohr. He tells us that it is easy to train horses to raise the left foot or the right foot in response to the commands left foot or right foot, and that it will be the forefoot when one is standing in front of the horse, and the hind foot if one stands near the rear. It cannot be so very difficult, he thinks, even to get the horse to understand the commands left or right forefoot, and left or right hind foot, and all without any other aids but the spoken words. Should this really be possible without even the slightest kind of designating movement? The following case, again, I believe is undoubtedly based on a misinterpretation. Redding relates concerning his 19-year-old horse that he himself had owned for 13 years, and had always kept in single harness, that this horse not only understood the meaning of a long list of words, such as bureau, post office, school, churchyard, apple, grass, etc., but he also knew a number of persons by name, as well as their places of residence. If he were told in advance to halt at a certain residence, he would do it without any further aid from the driver. For this reason, the happy owner felt certain that the animal possessed a high order of intelligence, and that this horse does reason. What sources of error were here operative, whether signs were given by means of reins, or head or arm movement, could be determined only by a careful examination of the case. And finally, we would exercise some reserve in entertaining the suggestions for the acoustic education of horses which have come from various sources. Colonel Spohr, whom we have just been mentioning, thinks that it would not be a difficult matter to get a horse to respond with a walk to 1 smack of the lips, with a trot to 2 smacks, and with a gallop to 3, and then he could be made to slacken his pace once more into a trot in response to 1 long-drawn psst, and to stop in response to 2. Others have gone even further. Decroix, at one time leader in veterinary affairs in France, conceived the idea of working out a universal language as regards the commands that are given to horses, in the humane purpose of sparing them the whip. He called it volapük hippique. For the commands go, right, left, and halt, he suggests these: hi, ha, he, and ho, respectively. From these, it was possible to make 8 combinations, such as he for trot, he for left about, while the single he was to mean forward to the left, ho for back, etc. Decroix thought that the whole system could be inculcated in a very few lessons. He even had a medal struck which was to be awarded to the driver or rider who should first exhibit a horse, thus instructed, to the Société Nationale d'Acclamation de France, of which Decroix was president. 8 years have elapsed since then, but we have heard of no one who has earned the medal mentioned. In the future greater care will probably be exercised in the putting forth of such suggestions, and 2 sources of error may be guarded against, namely, involuntary movements on the part of the rider or driver, and imitation of the horses amongst themselves. 1 horse guarded by an experienced rider may serve as a copy for 10 others with inexperienced men in the saddle. End of footnotes. Horses compare very unfavourably with dogs in this respect. The latter easily learns to react with a high degree of precision to auditory signs, as I learned from a series of experiments which I was enabled to perform. The Osten horse, therefore, does not stand alone among his kind in his inferior auditory equipment, as one might be tempted to believe at first blush. It is easy to explain the musical accomplishments. The tones which were played for the horse were known to Mr. von Osten, since he himself played the harmonica, or when someone else played it, he, Mr. von Osten, could see the stoppers. He then thought of the number which indicated the tone in question, and Hans would tap it. Thus arose the tale of the horse's absolute tonal memory. This tale gained much support at the time, from an experience which has been recounted to me by the well-known composer, Professor Max Schillings. It shows more clearly than any other report how very confused were the threads that had been spun in the whole matter. In order to test the horse's musical ability, Professor Schillings played, let us say, 3 tones upon the accustomed instrument. Complying with Mr. von Osten's wish, Professor Schillings always indicated which 3 he was about to play. The horse always tapped them correctly. In order to make a decisive test, Professor Schillings then played, without anyone's knowledge, a note that was in reality a third below the one he had indicated to Mr. von Osten. Curiously enough, Hans tapped, as a matter of fact, the number indicating the note that was actually struck, and it was only in the 3rd repetition, and after many exhortations on the part of the master to have a care, that the horse finally tapped the number indicating the note Mr. von Osten had in mind, and which in truth was the wrong one. This curious experiment seemed to those to whom Professor Schillings communicated it to yield conclusive evidence of the horse's absolute hearing. As a matter of fact, however, Professor Schillings had unwittingly, and contrary to any intention on his part, inspired the horse. Standing, as he did, just behind the right shoulder of the horse, he was able to interrupt Hans, who had begun to tap in response to a move on the part of Mr. von Osten, by means of an involuntary movement which did the work of a closing signal. At the same time, Mr. von Osten, likewise standing to the right of the horse and expecting more taps, remained perfectly quiet. This is as it was in the tests mentioned on page 71, in which, of two experimenters, one started the horse tapping and the other stopped him. Mr. von Osten very probably lost patience after Hans had seemingly given the wrong response twice, and thereupon came nearer to the horse, and thus by monopolizing its attention, so as to exclude Professor Schilling's, was able to get the response so ardently desired. Footnotes. General Noizet has left us a story of the middle of the last century, which in essential detail corresponds closely with the one just given. The scene is a French chateau, and the hero is a rapping table, highly prized on account of the intelligent answers it could give. Seated about it were a number of ladies, and at the other end of the room sat a French savant, a member of the Academy. The ladies requested him to put a simple mathematical question to the table, and complying with their request, he asked for the cube root of 4. None of the ladies who sat at the table knew the solution. The table unhesitatingly gave 6 raps. This was refused as incorrect. The table was asked to try again, and again it rapped 6. For this it was bitterly reproached. Hereupon the questioner, who during the whole time had remained in his place at the other end of the room, came forward with the confession that the table was innocent, that he had made a mistake. He had asked for the cube root of 4, but had really meant to ask for the cube of that number, namely 64. And the table had, as a matter of fact, given the first numeral of that number. One is immediately struck by the analogy between this case and that of Professor Schilling's. In both cases, those immediately concerned, the women in this one, Mr. von Osten in the other, believe that a wrong answer is being given repeatedly. The cause of the error lies in a person who seemingly is not concerned with the response. The Frenchman asked a question, but did not sit at the table. Professor Schilling's sounded the notes, but it was Mr. von Osten who got the horse to tap. In both instances, the questioner asks one thing, but had something else in mind. With the Frenchman, it was a slip of the tongue. Mr. Schilling's did it purposely. And finally, in both cases, the response corresponds not to the question that had been asked, but to that which had been thought, so that, though seemingly wrong, the response of both table and horse were really correct. By way of explanation, Noizet believes that he has a case of true thought transference or telepathy, page 108. The questioner watched with utmost attentiveness the rapping of the table, and the women in turn regarded the man, and thus, Noizet believes, the man's thought was transferred to the minds of the others without the mediation of eye or ear, etc., and hence unvitiated by the words that had been spoken. I myself prefer another explanation. At that moment in which the rapping arrived at the expected number, the Frenchman executed a movement characteristic of release of tension, and to this the women of the circle reacted. It was not necessary that they should be able to account for this afterwards, just as sometimes occurs in the case of thought readers. It is very probable, too, that they were not of a very reflective turn of mind anyway. We are warranted, I think, in regarding the two cases as identical in kind. End of footnotes. When, in tests such as these, 2 stoppers were opened and thus 2 notes sounded, Mr. von Osten would count the number of stoppers intervening between the two, and Hans would tap the number. And so arose the tale of Hans's knowledge of musical intervals. Whenever the 2 notes were sung or whistled, in which case there would be no stoppers that could be counted, then Mr. von Osten, who was quite destitute of musical knowledge, was at a loss, and also Hans. If, however, the intervening notes were sung, then everything went smoothly once more. Major and minor chords were regularly characterized as beautiful, all others as bad, but even here errors occurred. The musician had taught Mr. von Osten these distinctions. The old man also knew the melodies that were played on the hand organ. Each one had a number assigned to it, and Hans was required to tap the number of the melody in token of recognition. Hans was as ignorant of musical time as he was of melody, and all attempts to get him to march in regular step were utterly futile. A number of musical tests were made in the absence of Mr. von Osten. In these Mr. Rahn undertook the questioner's role, and since he had musical training, he was aware of what the numbers should be even when he could not see the stoppers of the harmonica, and therefore we readily understand why it was that the horse responded so wonderfully in his case. The so-called musical ability of horses appears, from all that is known, to be confined within very narrow bounds. One fact is universally accepted, namely, horses of the military are believed to possess a knowledge of the significance of trumpet signals, and are often said to interpret them more readily than the recruits. Since no experiments had been made along these lines, I undertook to make a brief test of the cavalry horses mentioned on page 188. As in the preceding tests, the three animals were arranged behind one another with the customary distance of 2 horses' lengths between, and each was ridden by his accustomed rider. They were held by the reins, but received no aid of any kind, either to start them or to restrain them. A bugle then sounded the various signals at the other end of the barracks courtyard. We had been previously assured that the horses would certainly react without fail, but as a matter of fact the result was quite the contrary. 2 of the horses did not move at all, and the third, a 13-year-old gelding, was startled nearly every time and would tear off in a gallop, even though a trot had been sounded. I would not, however, venture to draw any conclusions from results such as these. Many more tests would have to be made, and some of them upon the whole squadron, before a judgment could be given. Footnote. Professor Flügel, basing his statement on an article appearing in Schürer's Familienblatt, Berlin 1890, No. 8, page 128, gives an account of similar experiments which were supposed to have been conducted by the Zoological Society of Westphalia and Lippe, and presumably showed that the horses of the military do not understand the bugle calls. No matter how well trained a horse may have been, it would not respond to a signal. This report, however, is due to a mistake. Such experiments have never been made by the society mentioned, so I am told by its director, Dr. Rieker. Nor do I know of anyone else who has made experiments of this kind. However, Professor Landois, an eminent zoologist, now deceased, founder of the scientific society mentioned, tested 4 circus horses for their musical ability and specifically for their sense of musical time. He arrives at the conclusion that horses have no feeling for time whatsoever. With but few exceptions, all experts today are of the same opinion. Horse trainers, especially, are universally agreed on this point. It is easy to see in any circus performance that it is not the horses that accommodate themselves to the music, but that the music accommodates itself to them, and that the trained horses are induced to do their artistic stepping only by the aids given by their riders. Furthermore, all these horses are trained without the use of music. It would therefore appear that the time has arrived when the tales of the dancing horses of the Sybarites ought no longer to gain credence. 2 Greek writers, Athenaeus and Aelian, tell us that the inhabitants of Sybaris, far famed for their luxurious habits, had trained their horses to dance to the music of flutes during their banquets. Building upon this, the men of Crotona, in one of their campaigns against the Sybarites, ordered the flute players to play the tunes familiar to the Sybarite horses. Immediately the well-trained steeds began to dance, thus throwing the whole Sybarite army into confusion, and the men of Crotona won the day. The same story is told in more detail concerning the horses of the inhabitants of Cardea. Both accounts, somewhat mixed, are to be found in Julius Africanus, a writer of the 3rd century of the Christian era. In recent years, a French veterinary surgeon, Grainon, experimented on the effect of music upon the horses of the military. He entered their stalls, playing upon a flute, and noted their behaviour. 4/5 of the animals, he says, were deeply moved, yes, delighted even. Charmé, one interpreter, calls it a case of hypnosis. This emotional excitement was expressed somewhat unaesthetically by the dropping of excrementa. Grainon characterizes the feeling state of these animals as being a mixture of pleasure and astonishment, of satisfaction and excitement, mélange du plaisir et d'étonnement, de satisfaction et de trouble. He also asserts that the horse's musical taste is similar to our own, but I can find nothing in his whole exposition which might prove this. Indeed, there is nothing that could be interpreted as anything other than a purely sensuous effect upon the horses. I may go a step farther, and say that thus far the sense of music, i.e. understanding of melody, harmony, and rhythm, has not been shown to exist in any animal. Some animals may, however, be susceptible to the sensuous pleasantness of the tones themselves. End of footnotes. I shall now turn to peculiarities of character, highly humanized, which have been attributed to Hans. His sympathies and antipathies, so called, were nothing but erroneous appellations for the success or failure on the part of the respective individuals to elicit responses. He who could procure answers frequently apparently stood high in the horse's favour. That Hans shook his head violently when asked by Mr. von Osten, "Do you like Mr. Stumpf?" and answered in the affirmative the further question, "Do you like Mr. Bush?" was nothing but a confession, unwilling to be sure, on the part of the master himself. In the first case the master thought no, in the second instance yes, and the two thoughts were accompanied by the corresponding head movements, to which Hans responded mechanically. Hans appeared to be well disposed towards me, but evidently because I always rewarded him liberally when he answered correctly, and I did not scold him when his responses were wrong, as did Mr. von Osten and Mr. Schillings, who instead of seeking the cause within themselves, were always ready to rebuke Hans for his contrariety and fickleness. The horse did not show, in so far as can be judged at all, any real affection for his master. On the other hand, it would be unwarranted to say that, in spite of all rewards, he developed a grudge against all those who bothered him with instruction and examination. Shortly after the close of our experimentation, it happened that Hans severely injured his groom by a blow in the face. Yet this man had always been very gentle with the horse, and had been forbidden by Mr. von Osten to make Hans solve any problems for him. Experts assure me that we have here to deal, not with a case of moral insanity, but with a very common experience, although this view will probably be cavilled at by enthusiastic lovers of horses. The work of so excellent an expert as Phyllis, for instance, bears us out in this respect. The horse's supposed fickleness was nothing but a token of the fact that even those who were accustomed to working with him did not have him completely in hand. They simply did not understand how to obtain correct responses from the horse. It often happened that in the evening, when it had become so dark that the movements of Mr. von Osten could no longer be seen, Hans had to suffer bitter reproaches because he made so many errors. That, in truth, he never was stubborn, and that the cause of failure really lay in the questioner, is shown by the fact that the mood, for which he was reproved, would disappear the moment the questioner voluntarily controlled the signals. We may add that there was no basis for the assumption that he had an uncommon, finely constituted nervous system, or was possessed of a high degree of nervousness. Both these phrases were often mentioned by way of explanation. Hans was restive, as horses usually are, and besides, he lived a life so secluded, he was never allowed to leave the courtyard, that as a result he was easily disturbed by strange sights and sounds. There was not the slightest trace of the clinical symptoms of neurasthenia. On the contrary, he gave the impression of perfect health, which was curious enough when we remember his rather unnatural mode of life. Hans's stubbornness was a myth. He was suspected of it whenever the same error occurred a number of times in succession, i.e., when the questioner did not properly regulate his attention, page 146, or when he was being controlled by perseverative tendency, mentioned on page 149. Mr. Schillings, who has provided me with material here as elsewhere, relates the following episode which occurred on one such occasion. To one and the same question put alternately by Mr. von Osten and Mr. Schillings, Hans responded correctly with 2 taps to the former, and just as persistently incorrectly with 3 taps to the latter. After Mr. Schillings had suffered this to occur 3 times, he accosted the horse peremptorily. "And now are you going to answer correctly?" Hereupon Hans promptly shook his head, to the great merriment of all those present. Mr. Schillings had, with no accounted reason, expected a no. Hans was called willful whenever the same question was successfully answered by different responses, as frequently happened with the increasing tension that characterized the high numbers, page 145. He was also regarded as stubborn when no reply at all was forthcoming, as in the tests with the blinders. Hans's supposed distrust of the questioner, when the latter did not know the answer to the problem, is nothing but a poor attempt to account for the failure of those tests. Hans's distrust of the correctness of his own responses was supposed to be evident from his tendency to begin to tap once more if, after the completion of a task, the questioner did not immediately give expression to some form of approval or disapproval, just as a schoolboy begins to doubt his answer if the teacher remains silent for a short time. In terms of the results of our experimentation, this would mean that whenever the questioner did not resume the erect posture after Hans had been given the final tap with the left foot, then the horse would immediately begin once more to tap with the other foot, page 61. As the evil characteristics, so, too, the goods. Thus his precipitancy, which was supposedly evidenced by his beginning to tap before the questioner had enunciated the question, was nothing but a reflection of the questioner's own precipitancy in bending forward, page 57. Never did Hans evince the slightest trace of spontaneity. He never spelled, on his own accord, anything like "Hans is hungry," for instance. He was rather like a machine that must be started and kept going by a certain amount of fuel, in the form of bread and carrots. The desire for food did not have to be operative in every case. The tapping might ensue mechanically as a matter of habit, for horses are to a large extent creatures of habits. This lack of spontaneity could hardly be reconciled with the horse's reputation for cleverness. It would not be necessary to touch upon the signs that were supposed to betoken genius, the intelligent eye, the high forehead, the carriage of the head, which clearly showed that a real thought process was going on inside. All these, we said, would not need mentioning, if they had not been taken seriously by sober-minded folk. If there is a report that Hans turned appreciatively towards visitors who made some remark in praise of his accomplishments, it is evidence only in the observer's imaginativeness. Turning from a consideration of the horse to that of the persons experimenting with him, footnotes. I cannot enter upon a discussion of the latest psychological problems here involved, partly because that would take us beyond the purpose of this monograph, and partly because they are still moot questions and hence not suitable to popular treatment. Briefly, though, they are these. What is the nature of the relationship between cognitive and affective states on the one hand, and involuntary, so-called expressive movements on the other? Is this connection an external thing, as it were, an association arising as a habit formation, or does every idea partake essentially of a motor character? Do purely cognitive states give rise to such movements, or does the movement impulse depend more particularly upon the affective consciousness accompanying the cognitive states? And in how far do given kinds of expressive movements depend upon certain ideational types? Compare page 95. Thus, what is the influence in the visual image upon the gestures for up, down, etc.? And then, are these involuntary movements, which are not noted, truly unconscious, or merely not attended to? In other words, are they below the pale of consciousness, or merely at the fringe? The various writers speak almost without exception of unconscious movements in the strict sense of the term. My own introspections, however, have led me to doubt whether they are quite unconscious. Since I have attained some practice, I am able to describe in detail, under conditions of objective control, my involuntary movements, no matter how slight, even down to mere muscular tensions. None of my subjects, however, has as yet succeeded in this. It is no very easy matter to be on the lookout for some unknown movements which might eventually occur, while attempting to concentrate attention to the utmost upon a certain definite ideational content, but this very dividing of attention effects a decrease in the force of the movement, and thus makes it all the more difficult to discover. From my own experience, however, I am inclined to believe that these movements are not unconscious, but merely unattended to. In other words, we have a narrowing down of the apperceived content within certain limits, but not a narrowing down of consciousness, much less a splitting of consciousness or of personality, as the thing unfortunately has sometimes been called. In order, however, not to be guilty of premature judgment, I have avoided the terms unconscious and unattended to, and choose expressions which leave these finer details untouched. End of footnotes. The first and most important question that arises is this: how was it possible that so many persons, there were about 40, were able to receive responses from the horse, and many of them on the very first occasion? The answer is not hard to find. All these persons came to the horse in very much the same frame of mind, which found a similar expression in all, in both posture and movements. And it was these motor expressions of the questioner, aside from the signs for yes and no, which I believe I have adequately explained on page 98, that the horse needed as stimuli for his activity. The next question that arises is, why did only a few persons receive responses regularly from hands, whereas the greater number were favoured only occasionally? What was the selective principle involved? The answer is that the successful person had to belong to a certain type, which embodied the following essential characteristics. 1. A certain measure of ability and tact in dealing with the horse. As in the case of dealing with wild animals, such as the lion, etc., hands must not be made uneasy by timidity of the questioner, but must be approached with an air of quiet authority. 2. The power of intense concentration, whether in expectation of a certain sensory impression, the final tap, or in fixing attention on some idea content, yes, no, etc. It is only when expectancy and volition are very forceful that a successful release of tension can ensue. This release of tension is accompanied by a change in innervation and results in a perceptible movement, and it was only when the thought of yes or up, etc. was very vivid that the nervous energy would spread to the motor areas and thence to the efferent fibres, and thus result in the head movement of the questioner. From infancy we are trained to keep all our involuntary muscles under a certain measure of control. During the state of concentration just described, this control is relaxed, and our whole musculature becomes an instrument for the play of non-voluntary impulses. The stronger the customary control, the stronger must the stimuli be which can overcome it. The steady, unremitting fixation, which resulted in the horse's selection of the cloths, also involves a high degree of concentration. 3. Facility of motor discharge. Great concentration was necessary, of course, but not sufficient. Persons in whom the flow of nervous energy tended to drain off over the nerves leading to the glands and the vascular system might betray great tension, not so much by movements as by a flow of perspiration. We have many excellent examples of this given by Manuvrier, or by a violent beating of the heart, blushing, and the like. In short, by secretory and vasomotor effects. Or it is not inconceivable that long dealing with the very abstract thoughts might have weakened the tendency of overflow to other parts of the brain, and that therefore the entire discharge is used up in those portions of the brain which are the basis of the intellectual processes. But if expressive movements occur, the motor pathways must be particularly unresisting in order to take up the overflow of psychophysic energy. This is the necessary condition for obtaining the tapping and the head movements on the part of the horse, although for the tapping there is still one other circumstance necessary, namely, 4. The power to distribute tension economically, i.e., the ability to sustain it long enough and to release it at the right moment, after the manner of the curves described on page 93, and to control properly the unavoidable variations which occur. Footnotes. The mental state just described is probably essentially the same as that of the spiritualistic mediums when they are occupied with table rapping and table moving. In both cases concentration is very intense, In other words, the field of attention is limited. We saw that this state not only favours the tendency towards involuntary movement, but on account of the absorption of the individual's attention by a certain limited content, the person will be unaware of the voluntary movements as they occur. And we are not necessarily here dealing with neurasthenic, hysteric, or other diseased nervous conditions. In the case of table rapping, there are movements of the hands. In our case, there are those of the head. Our head, balanced as it is upon the cervical vertebral column, is continually in a state of unstable equilibrium, and therefore peculiarly susceptible to movement impulses of every kind. But I could induce not only movements of the head, but also of the arms and legs, and this by having the subject assume a posture which enabled him to hold arms or legs in as unstable a position as possible. He might stretch out his legs horizontally before him, or he could raise them vertically upwards, as in the handstand in gymnastic work. An extract from a treatise by Count A. de Gasperin, which appeared about the middle of the last century, may serve to show how close the correspondence between the two processes, that of getting the table to rap and that of causing hands to respond, really is. The report of this writer, based upon the detailed record of his tests in table movement and table rapping, closely parallels in many minute details observations which were made in the course of our experimentation with Hans. The case is all the more remarkable when we bear in mind that this writer did not seek the cause of the phenomena, as we did in involuntary movements, but thrusting aside this explanation, he posited the cause of the agency of some mysterious fluid. It may not be amiss to say that this, as well as most other references, were consulted after the present experiments and introspections had been completed. Of the page references preceding the following citations, the first always refers to the page in the French original, and the other, enclosed in brackets, to the parallel passage in the present monograph. Page 49, 31. Some questioners are especially suitable, expérimentaires hors ligne, but in their absence other persons may also operate successfully. Le succès, quoique moins brillant à l'heure, n'est pas impossible. Page 25, 229. But even the most suitable questioners do not always succeed equally well. Le plus sûr d'eux-mêmes ne réussissait pas également tous les jours. Page 42, 151. When the questioner is in any way indisposed, the measure of success is also less. Page 91 and 87, 150. The questioner must first get into the sweep of things, en train, and once he has done so, all interruption whatsoever must be avoided. Page 91, 93. Unless there is sufficient attention on the part of the questioner, the test will fail. La volonté est-elle absente? Rien ne bouge. Page 210, 93. When there is too low a degree of tension, then too great a number will be tapped. Si votre volonté nulle les tables arrête pas au moment où se termine le chiffre pensé, elles continueront indéfiniment. Page 31, 93. But too great concentration of attention will also produce failure. S'il n'arrivait du désirer trop fortement le succès et de m'impatienter en cas de retard, je n'avais plus aucune action sur la table. Page 36, 151. If the proper mood, en train habituel, is wanting and the tests are unsuccessful, it is best not to attempt some new and difficult experiment, but to turn to some that are simpler and more entertaining. La table obéissait mal, le coup étant frappé mollement et comme un regret. Alors nous avons pris un parti dont nous nous sommes bien trouvés. Nous avons persévéré et persévéré gaiement. Nous avons écarté la pensée de tentatives nouvelles et insisté sur les opérations essais et amusantes. Après un certain temps, les dispositions étaient changées. La table bondissait et attendait à peine nos commandants. Page 199, 41, 90. It is not necessary to enunciate the questions aloud. On est convenu que celui qui commanderait ne prononcerait pas à haute voix le nombre de coups, mais se contenterait de les penser, après les avoir communiquées à l'oreille de son voisin. Eh bien, la table a obéi. Il n'y a jamais eu la moindre erreur. Page 199, 64 and the following. The large numbers are tapped more rapidly than the small ones. La table a indiqué notre âge tel qu'il était dans notre esprit, se hâtant même de la manière la plus comique lorsque le nombre de coups à frapper était un peu considérable. Page 210, 35 and the following. Tests in which procedure was without knowledge failed completely. Les tables ne révèlent pas ce qui n'est pas dans la pensée et dans la volonté de l'expérimenter, quand on veut les charger d'autre chose que d'obéir comme des membres, on arrive à des erreurs continuelles. Page 28, 29, 270, 72. When of two experimenters each tries to get the horse to tap a different number, then that one who is better able to compel the animal's attention will be the successful one. L'une veut faire prévaloir un chiffre pensé plus considérable, l'autre un chiffre pensé moins considérable. Eh bien, l'opérateur le plus puissant l'emporte. Ainsi A est chargé secrètement de faire frapper 24 coups. B est chargé secrètement de l'arrêter à 18. A l'emporte et les 24 coups s'achèvent. On fait maintenant l'envers. B est chargé secrètement de faire frapper 13 coups. A est chargé secrètement de l'arrêter à 7. A l'emporte encore et le chiffre 7 ne peut être dépassé. End of footnotes. The experience of a number of practical men who have had much to do with horses and yet achieved but very modest success with Hans goes to show that it is not always the lack of sufficient authoritativeness mentioned under heading 1 that is the sole cause of failure, as has been claimed so often. That the horse was, to a certain degree, influenced by this element of authority is shown, however, by the following incidents. A certain gentleman, when alone in the courtyard with Hans, received responses only so long as I, concealed in the barn, kept the barn door open just a little, so that my presence would be known to the horse. As soon as I closed the door, Hans refused to respond to the gentleman. Those who possessed sufficient power of concentration and the requisite motor tendency, the two characteristics mentioned under 1 and 2 above, were able to obtain responses from the horse without any previous practice. Practice merely effected a more economic distribution of attention, so that the larger numbers especially were more successful as a result, pages 68 and 89. Those who were lacking either of the characteristics mentioned under 2 and 3 would not be aided even by the greatest amount of practice, as is shown by the case mentioned in Supplement 3, page 255. That many individuals were at first successful, but were later unable to get any successful responses, is to be accounted for by the fact that the power of concentration, at first present, later rapidly disappeared. This temporary increase in the power of doing mental work was at first investigated experimentally by Rivers and Kraepelin, and was called by them Antrieb, and aptly likened to the first pull of a team of horses in starting off. This, too, explains an experience which befell a number of the horse's visitors, who later described it to me. Wishing to utilize a momentary absence of Mr. von Osten, he excitedly put a hasty question to Hans, and with amazing regularity received correct responses. Besides Mr. von Osten, Mr. Schillings, and myself, not many were always able to induce Hans to bring the coloured cloths or to execute the head movements. It was easy, on the other hand, to get him to nod. Therefore, there was some truth in Mr. von Osten's assertion that Hans would be unable to answer a difficult question if he had not previously indicated by means of a nod that he had grasped its import. Those who were not concentrating sufficiently would not look into Hans's face when he was expected to nod, and would not bend over when Hans ought to begin tapping. Such persons could not, therefore, since they did not induce Hans to nod, elicit the tapping. I myself saw the no successfully elicited only in the case of Mr. von Osten, Mr. Schillings, and Mr. Rahn, the right and left only in the cases of the former two. it must remain uncertain whether the failure on the part of otherwise suitable persons to elicit the responses for right and left was due to their accompanying these ideas by movements of the eyes instead of by movements of the head, page 106. For unfortunately it was not possible to make special tests to discover whether Hans reacted to isolated eye movements. There is, however, more than one reason why I would doubt this. Taken all in all, there were but few persons who were entirely representative of the type described, compare page 31. They were those who are commonly characterized as being of a lively temperament and strongly impulsive. Thus Hans acquired a reputation for Einkennigkeit, that is, he would accustom himself only to certain persons. Such a reputation was hard to reconcile with his much praised intelligence. In closing, just a word on the influence of the public that was present. As shown on page 69, the public in general did not influence the horse in his reactions. The effect upon the questioner, however, was unmistakable, and worked in a twofold manner. On the one hand, the questioner's zeal was increased, and with it the tension of concentration. On the other hand, it introduced an element of diversion, and attention was divided between the horse and the spectators, and thus concentration suffered. If the disturbing effect was slight, as in the case of Mr. von Osten, then the favourable influence exercised by the presence of the public outweighed the unfavourable. Mr. von Osten was, for that reason, often particularly successful when working in the presence of a large body of spectators. This was noted by many and was ascribed to the ambition of the horse. When, however, a person was easily diverted, as was Mr. Schilling's, then the presence of the public had a less fortunate effect. This, then, completes my explanation of the facts gleaned from observation and experimentation. It accomplishes all, I hope, that may be expected of an explanation. All the known achievements of the horse, all the successes and failures of the questioner, have been reduced to a single principle. No secondary hypothesis has been invoked, and but slight pace has been given to the element of chance. Nevertheless, it may not be out of place to forestall two objections which might possibly be raised. First, some may assert that it was through our experimentation that the horse became mechanized and incapacitated as regards conceptual thinking, that formerly he really could solve arithmetic problems, and that only later developed the very bad habit of depending upon the signs which I gave him. This objection is to be refuted in that I did not originate these signs, but first noted them in Mr. von Osten himself, and that Hans still works as faithfully as ever for Mr. von Osten. I have learned from many trustworthy witnesses that the horse still continues to give brilliant exhibitions of his ability. If, on the other hand, anyone should assert that it was only with us that Hans reacted to movements, but that with his master he really thought and still thinks, then I must ask for proof. This latter argument is by no means very original. When Faraday in 1853 proved experimentally that table rapping is the result of involuntary movements on the part of the participants standing about the table, the spiritualists asserted that his experiments had nothing in common with their own proceedings, because his subjects, who, by the way, had been up to that time firm believers in table rapping, probably did move the table, they said, while they, the spiritualists, do no such thing. End of Section 9. Section 10, Chapter 6. Genesis of the reaction of the horse. In the preceding discussion we have regarded the achievements of the horse, as well as Mr. von Osten's explanation of them, as matters of fact. Let us now consider the question, how did the horse come by these achievements, and how did its master arrive at his curious theory in explanation of them? Did he indeed seek to instil in the horse's mind the rudiments of human culture through long years of painstaking instruction in accordance with the method described in Supplement 1, page 245? If this is the case, then, of course, his hoped-for success was only seeming, not real. Or did he, as so many critics aver, systematically train the horse to respond automatically to certain cues, and propound his theory merely for the purpose of misleading the public? There might possibly be another alternative, namely, was there a mixture of instruction and of training to respond to cues? The production of the horse's achievements would not require a great deal of explanation if it were a case of mere training for the purpose of establishing certain responses to certain cues. It might be desirable, however, before deciding in favour of one of these possibilities, to indicate briefly the process of development, as it might occur if the point of view is taken that bona fide instruction was given. This development would probably be as follows. Mr. von Osten, as the result of theoretical speculation or of a misinterpretation of the facts of experience, having arrived at the conclusion that the horse possessed extraordinary capacity, finally undertook to instruct a certain horse for a period covering 3 years. This one having died, he, nothing daunted, undertook the education of another one. What it was that influenced this old teacher of mathematics to deprive humankind of the benefit of his extraordinary pedagogical ability and love of teaching, we do not know. It may be that he had had bitter experience in that line, or again, mayhap the newness and tremendousness of this other task stimulated him. His first problem must have been to arouse the interest of the animal in this process of education. It was hardly to be believed that Hans could eagerly cooperate in a process which promised to yield him no immediate benefit. The teacher sought to overcome this lack of immediate interest by the means of rewards. To Hans, the sweet carrot was as toothsome a bite as candy is to the child, and since the horse was furthermore kept on low rations on account of the relatively low amount of physical exercise he took, the anticipation of the carrots was doubly enticing. The first thing that Mr. von Osten sought to teach the horse, according to his own statement, was the significance of the names of colours and of the spatial directions such as up, down, etc. In the case of children, there is a simple test by means of which we may discover if they have put any content into these words. The test is, do they themselves use them correctly? Do they call the blue, blue, and the red, red? Since the horse could not speak, the instructor had to give him some other means by which he could make himself understood. He taught Hans to approach the colours and select the cloth of the colour wanted. He also taught him to make those movements of the head or body which correspond to the expressions up, down, etc. First of all, Hans had to be taught to bring the cloths. Then began the pointing out of the different colours, accompanied each time by their proper names. It is very probable that at first Hans had to be led each time to each separate coloured cloth and taught to raise it or to touch it with his nose. Later, Mr. von Osten, after having pronounced the name of the colour, remained at his place with his head and body directed to the cloth in question and gazing intently at it, in order to see whether or not the horse was pointing out the right one. Naturally, Hans would, at first, fail 100 times where he would succeed but once, but since the horse would receive the anticipated reward in case of success, he gradually became conscious that this reward was attached to executions which had some special mark. This special mark would be expressed in human speech by the statement that the horse would go in the direction indicated by the position of the instructor's body. For Hans, of course, this would not take the form of an abstract statement, but simply of a definite way of seeing and of going, and a correlation of the two in a certain definite manner, the whole being a process, the elements of which remained unanalyzed and unaccounted for by Hans. Owing to the position of the eye, it was possible for him to keep his master within his field of vision while he was approaching the cloths, and only when he had correlated his approach in a certain definite manner with his visual perception of the master, i.e. only when he had felt his way, as it were, along the latter's line of vision, did he receive his reward. A sufficient number of repetitions was all that was necessary to establish an association in the psychological sense of the term. In the same manner, dogs will learn, as was indicated on page 177, to bring an object upon which the master has fixed his gaze, it mattering little whether or not the name of the object be enunciated. There is only this difference, that in the case of the dog it is not possible to keep the image of the master within the field of vision, but neither is it necessary, for he has recognized the object before he has started for it. We must remember, however, that it does not simplify an attempt at explanation to assume that Mr. von Osten consciously trains the animal to respond to certain bodily positions of the questioner, for, even in this case, it would be necessary to explain how it was possible for him to train the horse to heed the cues. In the course of time, the instructor may have noticed that whenever he moved during the course of a test, the horse invariably failed. But he may have regarded this merely as an incidental distraction and afterward was careful to remain quiet. As soon as he increased the number of cloths upon the floor, it was no longer possible for him to give the horse such accurate directive signs, and the number of errors consequently increased. Ascribing them to the inattentiveness of his pupil, he sought to encourage him by such calls as "Look out," "Look there," "See there," believing that, thus, he was directing the horse's attention to the desired colour. Without understanding the meaning of the calls, Hans learned, however, to keep moving just as long as the calling continued, for if he did this he was regularly rewarded. An association was established between the call and the impulse to move on, and with these two associations established, Hans gave the impression of having grasped the meaning of the colour terms. The origin of the proper movements in response to the terms up and down may be explained by the fact that the movements themselves were practised in a purely external fashion. Thus, whenever the word left was pronounced, the horse's head was pulled to the left by means of the bridle, or the reward was held off to that side. Later, Mr. von Osten, who looked expectantly at the horse's head, whenever he pronounced the word would unconsciously move his own head in the direction which he desired the horse to turn. This is quite in accord with the words of Darwin to the effect that whenever we wish an object to move in a certain direction, it is well nigh impossible for us to inhibit an unconscious, involuntary movement in that direction. Proof for this may be found on all sides in daily experience. Imagine, for instance, the strain sessions of the bowler or billiard player as he follows the moving ball. It is impossible to decide whether Mr. von Osten consciously continued to image the head movements which he expected the horse to make, or whether these anticipatory images later remained below the threshold, as was always the case with Mr. Schillings and myself, see page 100. But this question is of little significance, for even assuming that he always thought of the movement he expected on the part of the horse, this by no means implies that he was conscious of the movements on his part, which were associated with the thought process. Everything up to this point might be explained as the working of simple memory association, but when we come to problems in counting and arithmetical calculation, we are in the field of conceptual thought. Here again it was necessary for Mr. von Osten to invent a suitable means of expression for the horse, and once more this had to be borrowed from the treasury of gesture language. Tapping with the hoof was naturally hit upon as one of the normal expressive movements of the horse. This has long been used by trainers in preparing horses for show purposes. The method used in training the horse to make this response is of no import, whether it was by touching his foot with the hand or tapping his leg or by any other means. It is possible that many will declare, as being nonsensical, any attempt to introduce number concepts. Footnote. The author intends to take up the problem of counting, so-called, on the part of animals, and of the principle involved in another work soon to be forthcoming. End of footnote. Into an animal's mind, because the necessary motor basis is lacking. We will not, just at this point, stop to discuss whether or not it was not possible to develop number concepts from purely auditory or visual representations. It is evident, however, that Mr. von Osten believed that a motor basis was some sort of essential. In the case of man, this basis is found in the enunciation of the number names, or in the manipulation of the fingers. Mr. von Osten seemed to think that he was justified in assuming that, even in the case of the horse, some form of inner articulation of the word sounds was possible. At the same time, in so doing, he did not blink at the psychological difficulty of this hypothesis. The tapping of the foot was to be regarded merely as the expression of the process of inner counting, but not as the motor basis of the process. For this latter purpose tapping would be quite inadequate, for the number complexes which arise in the summation process of counting could not be differentiated by mere tapping with the foot, any more than a child could learn to count by employing only one finger. Mr. von Osten evidently imagined the process was somewhat like this. Whenever Hans was about to count to 5, he would enunciate inwardly the numbers from 1 to 5, and would accompany each word with a tap of the foot. Since, furthermore, wooden pins and balls would be used, as in the case of children, for giving visual content in learning the significance of the number terms, it seemed as if all the conditions necessary for the formation of number concepts were supplied. However, the most essential thing had to be presupposed, namely, that the horse virtually possessed the general power of forming concepts. Footnotes. There are some who believe they are warranted in concluding the opposite from the structure of the animal's brain alone. We may say that the brain of the horse, compared with that of the ape, or even that of the dog, represents a relatively low type of development, but owing to the rapid changes in the views, often contradictory, concerning the nature of the nervous structures and processes underlying the thought process, any conclusion based on such views would be premature. For this reason we cannot agree with the French physiologist who was dissecting the brain of a horse, and, struck by its smallness of size, exclaimed, "When I saw your proud look and beautiful neck, I hesitated a moment before mounting upon your back. But now that I have seen how small your brain is, I no longer have any qualm about using you." End of footnotes. And that all that had been lacking was the suitable conditions for its development. Mr. von Osten held tenaciously to this conviction, and it was this conviction that was the basis for the infinite patience with which the tests had been pursued. To come now to the learning process itself, we may assume that, at first, whenever the horse began to tap in response to commands, he would receive a reward for this purely mechanical feat. Wooden pins were then planted on the ground and designated as 1, 1, 2, etc., and each time someone would raise the horse's foot as many times as the count demanded. See Supplement 1. Then Mr. von Osten would take his stand at the horse's side and would command him, let us say, to tap 3. Hans, noting merely from his master's position that he was expected to tap, would begin. The instructor, who had bent forward in order to watch the horse tapping, footnotes. This natural and close connection between the process of attention and the movement towards the object attended to is clearly expressed in our English and French terms, derived from the Latin tendere ad, to reach towards, end of footnotes, would involuntarily straighten up again at the third tap, without being conscious of it, and quite unaware that he was thus giving a signal. The horse would be startled, and sometimes he would immediately cease tapping, and sometimes not. But it was only in the first case that he would receive a reward. Thus, unknown to the instructor, an association became established between the sight of the upward jerk of the instructor and the act of ceasing to tap. To be sure, the animal would receive sundry visual impressions from the wooden pins set up before him and the auditory stimulations of the spoken number names, on the basis of which the concepts were to be formed in his mind. But in this chaos of visual impressions, at times there were 2 wooden pins, then 3, then 4, sometimes there were the pins, at others the balls of the counting machine, and the babble of word sounds which evidently meant nothing but noise to him. Amidst all this there was but one constant element, the final movement of the instructor's body. The moment the horse reacted to this, he would receive the tidbit at the hands of his overjoyed master, and thus he became more and more accustomed to attend to this jerk, even after it had gradually decreased in scope. And the reason again why this jerk tended to become less pronounced was that the tests were gradually becoming more and more successful. For, corresponding to the degree in which the horse began to react properly, the instructor's tenseness and excitement tended to decrease, and with this decrease of the emotional element in the man's consciousness, the accompanying non-voluntary expressive movement gradually became less pronounced until it attained that extraordinary refinement which it possesses today. We noticed also that whenever the horse, for any reason, had to be trained anew, Mr. von Osten's movements would, on the whole, become somewhat more gross, as for instance after the tests with blinders. There is not a shadow of a doubt that this increase in the movement's extent was entirely unintentional, since the horse could not see his master at all on account of the blinders which had been attached to the trappings. In the same way it is possible to explain the details. Mr. Van Osten himself said that at first Hans had tapped at times with his left foot, at times with his right, just as he pleased. But later his master taught him to tap only with the right. Whenever he began with the left, Mr. Van Osten would immediately interrupt him, and he was allowed to add only a final tap with his left foot. Thus, this additional tap, which was sometimes made with the left foot, was but the vestige of an earlier rudimentary habit. The signal for it was the stooping position in which the master remained after the head jerk had been made. Whenever Mr. Van Osten had given Hans a small number to tap, he would bend forward only a little, but when he expected a larger number, he would bend forward somewhat more, owing to the desire to observe the tapping more carefully. From the slight inclination of the master's body, the horse would get the cue that he was expected to tap for a short time only. By the greater degree of inclination, he would know that he was to tap for a longer period. In the second case, he tapped rapidly and did not raise his foot as high from the ground, evincing a regard for the saving of energy, which may well be attributed to a horse. And thus arose the connection between the degree of inclination of the instructor's body and the horse's rate of tapping. So, now that the ability to count and solve problems had become fixed, as the old gentleman thought, he began to instruct the horse in other branches. Since everything had to be translated into terms which were to be expressed by means of tapping with the foot, and thus really put into terms of number, which was perhaps natural for an old teacher of mathematics, the same mechanism was involved in these accomplishments as in those of counting, etc. Mr. Van Osten saw the animal's intelligence steadily increase, without having the slightest notion that between his words and the responsive movements of the horse there were interpolated his own unconscious movements, and that instead of the much desired intellectual feats on the part of the horse, there was merely a motor reaction to a purely sensory stimulus. It has been a common custom of man to posit some extraneous cause for movements resulting from certain involuntary motions of his own, of which he is not aware. Witness the divining rod. Footnote. G. Franzius, Privy Council to the Admiralty, Master of the Dry Dock at Kiel, is responsible for the undeserved revival of the ancient belief long buried by science that the divining branch is put into motion solely as the result of the influence of hidden springs or treasures, and without any agency in the person who is holding it. The untenability of this theory comes home to us most forcibly when we recall how various are the kinds of things which have been discovered by means of the branch. First, there is gold and water, which are the only ones mentioned by Mr. Franzius. The water can be thus discovered only when it flows below ground, say that which is passing through the mains of a city, whereas the water of the Rhine or the Elbe would have no effect on the branch. Besides gold, every other kind of metal has been supposedly located by the branch, as well as coal, gypsum, ochre, red chalk sulphur, and petroleum, according to the desire of the one searching. Thus the very same branch that just a moment ago was influenced by the least bit of underground water may remain unaffected by the presence of a large body of water, if in the meantime I have changed my plan and decided to search for coal or for gold. But that is not all. The branch will point out a murderer or the place where a murder has been committed. It will discover the thief or his trail, as well as the things stolen or merely touched by him. It will indicate where the boundary stone that has been moved ought to stand. The branch further discloses the sins of the person concerning whom it is consulted, as well as their talents and abilities, the journeys they have made, and the wounds they have received. It will indicate whether or not a person has money and how much. It can announce what absent persons are doing and what apparel they are wearing and of what colour it is. It will give information on theological, medical, zoological and botanical questions. In fine, no matter what the question, it will never fail of an answer. The impossibility of explaining the phenomena in a purely physical way was recognized at a very early date. For a long time the activity of the users of the divining rod seems to have been restricted to the search for metals. The first, or one of the first, to raise his voice against it was the learned G. Agricola, 1556. and after him there were many who all wrote more or less independently of one another. Aside from swindle and chance, it was usually believed that sorcery of the agent of Beelzebub was involved, and for that reason the Church has repeatedly forbidden the use of the divining rods. But even in the 17th century we find some who believed that it was imagination alone that moved the person's hand, and with it the rod. Fortasis etiam fantasia manum in motum consitante, and that points out the essentials of the solution of the phenomenon, and we will not go into the matter here in detail. A number of complex psychological problems arising in connection with it are still waiting to be solved, but this much appears certain. The staff or branch plays no other part in the whole process than that which is served by the three levers in the test described in Chapter 4, pages 116 and following. They simply magnify the expressive movements of the diviner, and so we can understand why the instruments serving as rod might be so varied. Hay-forks, pickets, clock springs and pendulums, scissors and pliers have been used. A knife and fork, or two pipes fastened together, an open book, and even a sausage grasped at both ends, and thus bent together somewhat, all have served the purpose equally well. We can understand, too, how some adepts are able to achieve the same degree of success, for they do succeed beyond a doubt, without any rod whatever, but simply by placing the index fingers end to end and bending them somewhat, and even by merely groping about with hands outstretched or folded before them. End of footnotes. And furthermore, when these results appear to be rational, the tendency is to seek their cause in some extraneous intelligence, not his own. Just as the spiritualist ascribes the messages which are revealed to them through table rapping to certain rational spirits, so Mr. Van Osten credited the intelligence of the horse with the result produced by his own involuntary signs, i.e. with the proper solution of problems. Two other phenomena may have tended to strengthen Mr. Van Osten's belief in Hans's intelligence. One was the misleading similarity with which the horse's supposed errors in computation and the poorly adjusted concentration of the questioner were expressed. We recall the difficulty in the case of very high numbers. This might be considered as being due to the horse's ability to work more readily with small rather than with large numbers, whereas, as a matter of fact, it was due solely to the difficulty of the questioner to keep his attention concentrated upon the number for so long a time. We recall also the frequency of errors of 1 unit too few and 1 unit too many. These were easily interpreted as miscounts on the part of Hans, but in truth were the result of the poorly concentrated attention of the questioner. Added to this was the seeming independence and self-sufficiency of the horse. Often the number given by him was other than that desired by his master. Usually Hans was in the wrong in such cases, but sometimes, too, he was right. In any case, this served to give the impression of independence of thought which his master so thoroughly believed he possessed, and which was the goal of his endeavours, though as a matter of fact he was farther removed than ever from that goal. Some may ask, does not this whole process partake in the essentials of all training, though cumbersome and misunderstood to be sure? And is there any need of investigating whether or not the actual development was of the sort here outlined, or whether it actually took the course common to all training? In order to answer this question, we must determine more specifically what we mean by the term training. Usually we take it to mean the establishment of the animal of definite habits of motor reaction in response to certain stimuli purposely selected by the trainer, and without involving any process of animal consciousness other than association. Such a conception may be applied also to man, if we assume that the higher thought processes can be eliminated. If that were the case, the above definition would not have to be changed, not even with regard to the word animal, for we must take it in the antique sense of zoon, a signification readopted by modern zoology. The concept may be widened, however, by omitting the differentia of purpose, or even more, by including the habitual association of ideas or images, instead of movements, with certain sensory stimuli, but in doing so we must bear in mind that we are going beyond the usual content which in everyday practice is put into the term training, especially when we cease to regard the presence of purpose in the trainer's mind, both in giving the stimulus as well as in the habituation of the animal to them, as essential. When this is done, the conception of training really resolves itself into the much wider conception of habit building, and the whole discussion becomes merely a quarrel over words. In order to obviate this, let us bear in mind that in the following the word training is always taken in the usual and narrower sense. The term then is still ambiguous only insofar as it is not merely its original significance of the act of purposely habituating a person or an animal to perform certain definite movements, but by transference it is also used to denote the effect, i.e., the occurrence of the movements in question. But this does not really detract from the clearness of the concept itself. Having cleared up the question of definition, let us return to our original problem. Does the hypothetical account of the probable development of the horse's reactions, which is given on pages 213 to 220, represent a case of training? This must be denied decidedly with regard to the tapping of numbers and the solution of arithmetical problems. For here the sensory stimuli which were purposely given, i.e. the wooden pins, the balls, and the spoken words, were intended to subserve the function of arousing not movement but thought processes in the horse, whereas the function of the horse's movements was to give expression to these thought processes. Of the really effective stimuli, the slight movements on his part, the master was never conscious, much less were they purposely made. The same holds true for the up and down, yes and no, etc. For here also Mr. von Osten counted upon the rise of the corresponding concepts, and not merely upon a purely external mechanical association of meaningless sounds with certain movement responses on the part of the horse. This might also explain the genesis of Mr. von Osten's belief that Hans was able to mentally put himself in the place of the questioner. At any rate, it is very improbable that he, Mr. von Osten himself, clearly distinguished between the concept up and the sound of the word up. When we come to consider the horse's selection of the coloured cloths, and even more his leaping and rearing, we find that the distinction between training and instruction vanishes. If we had to deal only with this class of achievements, we might perhaps say, without fear of going very far wrong, that the only difference between this and the ordinary form of training was that Mr. von Osten had intended to train the horse to respond to auditory signs, words, but had unintentionally trained him to respond to visual signs instead. But it is not this type of performance that has become the bone of contention. Just as it would be misleading to maintain that Mr. von Osten's effort was nothing other than a case of training, so it also would be unjustifiable to designate the result of his efforts by that name, since the really effective stimuli were not, as has been pointed out just now, given intentionally. As far as the horse was concerned, it is a matter of indifference whether or not really effective stimuli were given intentionally by the questioner. The animal knows nothing of human purposes, and if he were transferred to a circus he would find nothing new in the method employed there except the use of the whip. We, however, define our concepts from the human and not from the horse's point of view. We may definitively say, therefore, that the method described cannot be regarded as that of training, neither in its application nor in the effect produced, though in the latter it closely simulates the effect of the training methods. Having thus differentiated between the methods of instruction and training, let us now attempt to decide on the basis of such indications as we may possess which of the two was actually represented by the development of the horse's attainments. Surveying the facts which we have at hand, we may say that there are a host of reasons why we cannot assume that it was a case of training. Everything that we know from our own observation and from the well-attested statements of others, with regard to the actual process of instruction, weighs against the assumption. Another evidence of this is the long period of time which Mr. von Osten required, both in the case of Hans as well as with his predecessor, whereas the same end would have been much more speedily attained if it had been a case of training. A further argument is the fact that a large horse was selected for the purpose, whereas a small mare would have been far more suitable. Compare Clever Rosa, page 7. Again, the whip, that sorcerer's rod of all professional trainers, was here absent. And finally, many traits of character of Mr. von Osten, as well as his conduct during the whole course of events, militate against such an assumption. He generously turned the horse over to us, as he had given it over to Count du Castel, Count Matushka, and Mr. Schillings. He eagerly besought a scientific investigation. He had made several reports to different ministries. All these acts could only hasten the denouement. What could have been his motive? Some thought they detected an effort at pecuniary speculation, and an advertisement of June 1902 in the Militärwochenblatt, in which Hans was offered for sale, seemed to confirm the conjecture. Mr. von Osten says that this occurred at the time when he himself was sick and had become tired of the job. And why should he not be willing to sell even a thinking horse when he had become convinced that any other could be instructed in the same way? Besides, I have it on good authority that after the publication of the September report he received several exorbitant offers. To mention only one of them, a local vaudeville company was ready to pay him 30,000 to 60,000 marks per month. He refused every one of these offers. Some may say that perhaps he wanted still more, but if he knew that the day of judgment was close at hand, he also knew that before him, if ever, was the sunshiny day on which to make his hay. A more auspicious time he could never hope to see again. Let us add once more that he never charged admission to any of Hans's performances, although there were many who were anxious to see the horse, and many enthusiasts had come from a great distance. And finally, he was an old man, unmarried and entirely alone, a property owner, but a man whose wants were few and very simple, and his Hans was almost his sole companion. Is it possible that such a man, one who had all the pride of gentle birth, would become a trickster in old age, all for the love of money? The unreliability of Mr. von Osten's signs is good proof of their involuntary nature. Someone who had seen him work with the horse could not have helped noticing that he certainly did not have complete control over the animal, and was not able, at a given moment, to make Hans perform a certain feat, as would have been the case if the process had been one of training. Again and again Hans failed to make the right count. Before a large audience, one time, it took 4 tests to get him to tap properly up to 20, and in all 4 I could note clearly that it was Mr. von Osten who, by his involuntary premature movements, was the innocent cause of the failure. On another occasion, after Hans had done some beautiful work in fractions, in the presence of a large number of spectators, the master asked him the simple question, "Where is the numerator in a fraction?" The answer was first "to the left," and then, after a severe reprimand, "down" below, and finally "up" above. He often made just such incorrect movements of the head. In the colour selecting tests, the average of error was quite unpredictable. With an equal number of tests, on one day half would be successful, on another 4/5, on a third 1/10. Often Hans appeared to be indisposed for days at a time. The colour tests would often end in expressions of rage on the part of Mr. von Osten, and in consequence Hans would become startled and would then storm about the courtyard so that it was dangerous to try to approach him. Some may object that all this was mere comedy, and that possibly Mr. von Osten prevented some of the tests from turning out successfully. But this objection is to be met by the statement that very often failure would occur just when it was particularly desirable to have the tests appear in a favourable light before a large and enthusiastic assemblage of visitors. After such failures he would be downcast on account of Hans's contrariness. It is also significant that Mr. von Osten's percentage of error corresponds very closely with my percentage of error in the non-voluntary tests, page 84 and following, whereas he was never able to obtain the errorless results which I obtained in my voluntary experiments. But we must be careful not to confuse non-voluntary movement and lack of knowledge of the movement. And again, we must distinguish between knowledge of the grosser and the finer signals. Mr. von Osten was aware of the grosser movements and talked quite freely concerning them, but in doing so showed that he was quite unaware of their true function. He undertook to show us what we already knew, that when he remained standing perfectly erect, he could elicit no sort of response from Hans. Furthermore, that whenever he continued to bend forwards, Hans would respond incorrectly and with very high numbers. He knew also that Hans was distracted in his operations every time the questioner resumed the erect posture while the tapping was in progress. This he demonstrated to us on one occasion in the following manner. He said to Hans, You are to count to 7. I will stand erect at 5. He repeated the test 5 times, and each time Hans stopped tapping when the master raised his body. Several such tests resulted in the same way. Mr. von Osten, however, believed this to be a caprice of the horse, and at first declared that he would yet be able to eliminate it, but later became resignated to it as an irredeemable evil. Mr. von Osten was also aware that the questioner ought not move while the horse was approaching a coloured cloth, and cautioned me in regard to it, though I had already noted as much. And finally, he also knew what influence his calls had while the horse was selecting the cloth, and he told me that it was of great assistance to Hans to be admonished frequently, since thus his attention was brought to bear upon the proper cloth. Yet, when we requested Mr. von Osten to desist calling, since he was thereby influencing the horse in the choice of the cloth, he answered, "Why, that's just what I wish to do." But though the statement that he was aware of the nature of these grosser signs is thus seen to be true, it by no means necessarily implies that he had purposely trained the animal to respond to them. In these observations of his he had builded better than he knew. He evidently had no notion of their scientific significance. But the same thing might have happened to those who were supposed to be somewhat less naive, as is shown by the experience of Mr. Schillings, who quite unconsciously for many months had been giving not only the finer but also the grosser signs, and never guessed the true nature of affairs until I explained it to him. Nor was it an easy matter for me to get at the facts involved in the process, although it now all appears so very simple. On the other hand, it is also true that Mr. von Osten knew nothing whatever of the finer, more minute signals, such as the final jerk, the head movement upwards, downward, etc., and it is difficult to conceive how he might have gained any knowledge of them. We might perhaps conceive of 4 possible sources. He might have come upon them by chance, but it is extremely improbable that in the million of possible forms of signalling he should have hit upon those that at the same time represented the natural expressive movements, or he might have derived a knowledge of them through a study of the pertinent literature. I have searched diligently for such a source in both the old and the modern literature, but in vain. From the 16th century on, there is a series of accounts of horses that were able to spell and solve problems in arithmetic, and the reports of learned dogs go back even to the time of Justinian, in the middle of the 6th century. All these animals were kept for the purpose of speculation, and were exhibited for pecuniary reasons only. Nor does one read that any person could work with these animals off-hand, which was the characteristic feature of the Osten horse. Footnote. There is only one, and I believe it only a seeming exception, to be found in the literature on the subject. We are told about the year 1840 a French revenue official named Leonard had 2 hunting dogs that, besides other things, were able to play at dominoes, and this not only with their master, but with anyone, and without the master's assistance. The owner had educated them simply for the fun of it, and not for pecuniary gain. This statement is made by both writers, who, apparently independently of one another, have discussed the case, Youatt and de Terrade. De Terrade himself played with them, and gives directions on how to teach dogs to play the game. But his exposition is so naive, and even ridiculous, for those who know anything about the subject, that we do not believe it necessary to attempt a detailed refutation. Youatt never saw the animals, but he tells us that not only the dog's partner, but also the master, sat at the game. Youatt's assertion, however, that not the slightest intimation could have been given by Mr. Leonard to the dog, but that the animal carried on the game by means of its own observation and calculation, appears to me a rather bold statement. After my own experience with dogs, I firmly believe this to have been impossible. Hatchée-Suplee, who shares my conviction, explains the matter as follows. The dog would simply place a domino having the number of eyes named by his partner, thus the 6 adjacent to the 6, the 3 to the 3, etc. But even so great a deal would have to be attributed to the dog, although in that case real counting would by no means be absolutely necessary, for an association between the number term and the total picture of the corresponding group of eyes would suffice. but we must note that neither of the writers mentions that the numbers were always called aloud by the partner. After the failure of the experiment of Sir John Lubbock, we must doubt very much if a dog is able to match one domino with another having the same number of eyes. We are therefore inclined to believe that this dog continually received signs from its master. These signs probably were visual, perhaps also auditory, and they were by no means involuntary. For in a book on the training of animals, which Leonard, the owner of the dogs, has published, and in which he describes minutely the methods by which they had been trained in their various accomplishments, he does not mention with so much as a syllable the game of dominoes, the thing which he certainly would have dwelt upon, if he had believed in the animal's power of independent thought. He would not have remained silent concerning this greatest, though only apparent, achievement of his educational endeavours, but his whole book is evidence that he was too wise to have thus deceived himself, and our only alternative is to believe that he was playing a joke on his credulous admirers. End of footnotes. In many cases we find mention made of the signs to which the animals reacted. Thus, for the beginning or stopping of the animal's scraping or tapping, the signals were respectively raising and lowering of the eyes on the part of the trainer, lowering and raising of the whip or of the arm, stepping forward or backwards, and as a closing signal a slight bending forward. The signals for beginning and ceasing to bark in the case of dogs were the trainer's commands to speak, and at the same time his looking at the dog, and then looking away for a closing sign, or a mouth movement on the part of the trainer, and then a withdrawing of the left hand which had been resting on the hip. Among the signs for nodding and shaking the head we find the following mentioned: raising and lowering the hand or arm or the whip, a movement of the hand toward the horse's nose as a signal for nodding, and an arm movement as signal for shaking the head. For this last we find recommended also a slight breathing upon the animal, and in the case of dogs a mouth movement simulating blowing, or a turn of the fingers. We will not dwell upon the many signals for selecting objects which are mentioned, since we have already discussed this point on page 230 and following. In all these instances it is plain that we have to do with purely voluntary and artificial signals. The only example of involuntary signs which Mr. von Osten could have found in literature was that of Huggins's dog, which need not be considered here, since, as was said on page 177, the really effective signs in that case were not discovered. A third means by which Mr. von Osten might have gained a knowledge of the involuntary natural expressive signs would have been by observing others. If he had had opportunity of observing another von Osten and another Hans, he might have gotten at the secret. But as this was not the case, this possibility vanishes. A fourth possibility is self-observation. We would then have to assume that Mr. von Osten at first really tried to educate the horse to think, but soon recognized the fruitlessness of such an attempt. At the same time, he then would have noticed his own involuntary movements and their effect upon the horse, and having noted them, voluntarily reduced their extent and utilized them in the training process. But here also there is much that militates against this assumption when we consider how great is the difficulty of consciously refining movements which at first were rather coarse, unless it be by the adjustment of the proper degree of concentration of attention, a subtlety of method of which we could hardly believe Mr. von Osten capable. We must remember also that in the first publication regarding Hans, which, by the way, marks the beginning of his career, Das Lesende und Rechnende Fürth, by Major General E. Zerbel in the Weltspiegel of July 7, 1904, we may read the following: He, Mr. von Osten, is always willing to have the horse undergo an examination on the part of a stranger, and promises that after Hans has become fairly well acquainted he will display the same degree of efficiency as he displayed with the master himself. This occurred at a time when Mr. Schillings, the man who was destined to prove the truth of the statement, had not yet appeared on the scene. How was Mr. von Osten to know beforehand that every questioner who might appear would execute the same movements that he himself had used? We would recall also that not one in the great multitude of persons who worked successfully with the horse in the absence of Mr. von Osten had noticed, even in the slightest measure, any of these movements in themselves. The position and repute of these persons vouches for their veracity. Among them were the writer of the article just mentioned, the Count zu Castel, Count Matuschka, Count von Eichstätt-Peterswald, General Köring, Dr. Sander, Mr. H. Suermont, and Mr. H. von Tepelaski. Some of these gentlemen were quite unwilling to believe that they executed such movements. This happened in the case of Mr. von Tepelaski, who had visited Hans 10 times and who had, during the course of these visits, frequently worked alone with the horse and had received correct responses. Count Eichstätt, too, although he was one of those who had been made acquainted with the nature of the movements involved before being allowed to visit the horse, was unable to note them either in his observation of Mr. von Osten or of himself, when, in compliance with his own wish, he was left alone with Hans. Nor did any of the laboratory subjects, some of whom were well trained in introspection, discover the true nature of affairs. They were thoroughly astonished when the facts of the case were explained to them, and I also, as was mentioned on page 100, did not become aware of my own movements until I had noted those of Mr. von Osten. In fine, everything would indicate that we have here not an intention to deceive the public, but a case of pure self-deception. Footnote. P. Wassmann, S.J., in the third edition of his book Instinct und Intelligenz im Tierreich, Freiburg, Herder, 1905, discusses the case of Hans and quotes from a letter I wrote him concerning the matter. In the quotation an error has crept in, which I would like to correct. The statement is ascribed to me that Hans differs from other horses only in his extraordinary power of observation, an unintentional byproduct of intentional training, whereas in my letter I said unintentional byproduct of intentional education. End of footnotes. This self-deception is easily understood when we consider the two predominant characteristics of the man, the pedantry of the pedagogue and his proneness to be possessed by a single idea, which is a peculiarity of those of an inventive turn of mind. Adhering closely to a preformed plan, he carefully and narrowly circumscribed the scope and order of instruction. He would not go on to the number 5 if he were not thoroughly convinced that the 4 had been completely mastered. Nor would he go on to a more difficult problem in multiplication unless he felt certain that Hans was entirely proficient in the problems of the simpler sort. If he had ever put a question to Hans before its regular order, he would have discovered, to his amazement, that there really existed no difficulty for Hans, and also that the horse really required no appreciable time to acquire new material. Mr. von Osten would have had a like experience if he had asked Hans concerning the value of Chinese coins or the logarithm of 1,000. However, he never did anything of the kind, but always adhered closely to his plan. He required the questioner to say 2 and 2 and never 2 plus 2, nor were capitals or Latin script to be used in the written material, and if upon request he did so, he did it without faith in the result, and hence there was failure. And so he declared that if you use Latin script, Hans will become confused and will be out of sorts for several weeks thereafter. Mr. von Osten is, and ever will remain, the schoolmaster, and will never become the psychologist, the sole vivisectionist, who would work a child with such puzzling questions, and Hans was to him like a child. Thus the old man believed himself to be a witness of a continuous organic development of the animal soul, a development which in reality had no other existence than in his own imagination. Added to this pedantry was an extraordinary uncritical attitude of mind, induced by his obsession by one favourite idea which blinded him to all objection. He met objectionable observations on the part of others in one of 2 ways. One method was by attributing to Hans certain remarkable qualities, such as an extraordinary keenness of hearing and a wonderful power of memory, or again certain defects such as moodiness and stubbornness, which as a matter of fact were only so many back doors by which he might escape from the necessity of offering adequate explanations. When Hans was able to give offhand a gentleman's name which he had heard years before, it was called a case of extraordinary memory. When the horse insisted that 2 times 2 was 5, he maintained that it was an example of animal stubbornness. there was still a simpler method of overcoming inconvenient objections, and that was by ignoring them altogether. The number 1, the simplest and most fundamental in the system of numbers, was one which was most difficult for Hans, page 67 and following. Mr. von Osten was aware of this, but thought little of it. During the very first visit by Professor Stumpf, Mr. von Osten asked the horse, "By how much must you increase the numerator of the fraction 7/8 in order to get a whole number?" Hans repeatedly answered incorrectly and always tapped numbers that were too great. The same question was then asked concerning the fraction 5/8, and immediately there was a correct response. The favourite number, 3. Mr. von Osten said very naively, "In the case of the difference of 1, he always goes wrong. It was just what I expected." Mr. von Osten still relates that the distinction between right and left created far greater difficulty for Hans than all of the work in fractions, and that even today it is not thoroughly established. Also, that the selection of coloured cloths is often a failure still, although it was one of the first things in which he was given instruction. It appears never to have dawned upon Mr. von Osten that the arts in which Hans seemed to excel also formed the standing repertoire of so many trained horses, regarding whom it was well known that they owed all of their cleverness to the training given them by their masters. This fact alone should have induced him to make some form of critical investigation. When Hans suddenly became a celebrity, and he, himself, the object of an enthusiastic following, the whole affair evidently took Mr. von Osten off his feet. Strangers took the further instruction of the horse in charge, and the rate and degree of Hans's progress became disconcerting. One day it came to pass that the horse even understood French, and the old gentleman, whose apostolic exterior had always exerted a high degree of suggestion upon his admirers, in turn fell captive to the spell of retroactive mass suggestion. He no longer was uneasy concerning the most glaring kinds of failure. On one occasion he even insisted upon the completion of a series of tests in which procedure was without knowledge, which promised no results whatever. "The animal's stubbornness must be broken," he commented. On the other hand, he regarded every criticism as a form of personal insult, and once he showed a member of the committee of the Society for the Protection of Animals the door because the man, without having looked at his watch, wanted to show it to Hans and ask him the time. Many other critics had similar experiences. Summarizing the remarks of this chapter, our judgment must be as follows. It is in the highest degree improbable that Mr. von Osten purposely trained the horse to respond to certain cues. It is also improbable that he knew that in every test he was giving signals, although I can form no judgment concerning what happened after the publication of the latest reports. To assume the contrary would land us in the middle of insoluble contradictions of the many ascertained facts in the case. The explanation here essayed, however, should prevent that. To be sure, we must then reckon with curious inner contradictions in Mr. von Osten's character, but such contradictions are to be found upon earnest analysis in nearly every human character, and Mr. von Osten must say with the poet, "Ich bin kein ausgeklügelt Buch, ich bin ein Mensch mit seinem Widerspruch." End of section 10. Section 11. Conclusion. If we would make a brief summary of the status of Mr. von Osten's horse in the light of these investigations, and try to understand what is the bearing upon the question of animal psychology in general, we may make the following statements. Hans's accomplishments are founded first upon a one-sided development of the power of perceiving the slightest movements of the questioner, secondly, upon the intense and continued but equally one-sided power of attention, and lastly, upon a rather limited memory, by means of which the animal is able to associate perceptions of movement with a small number of movements of its own which have become thoroughly habitual. The horse's ability to perceive movement greatly exceeds that of the average man. This superiority is probably due to a different constitution of the retina and perhaps also of the brain. Only a diminishingly small number of auditory stimuli are involved. All conclusions with regard to the presence of emotional reactions such as stubbornness, etc., have been shown to be without warrant. With regard to the emotional life, we are justified in concluding from the behaviour of the horse that the desire for food is the only effective spring to action. The gradual formation of the associations mentioned above between the perception of movement and the movements of the horse himself is in all probability not to be regarded as the result of a training process, but as an unintentional byproduct of an unsuccessful attempt at real education, which, though in no sense a training process, still produced results equivalent to those of such a process. All higher psychic processes which find expression in the horse's behaviour are those of the questioner. His relationship to the horse is brought about almost wholly by involuntary movements of the most minute kind. The interrelation existing between the ideas having a high degree of affective colouring and the musculature of the body, which is brought to light in this process, is by no means a novel fact for us. Nevertheless, it is possible that this case may be of no small value, on account of the great difficulties which are usually met in the attempt to establish experimentally the more delicate details in this field. And, returning to the considerations of the first chapter, if we may ask what contributions does this case make towards a solution of the problem of animal consciousness, we may state the following. The proof which was expected by so many that animals possess the power of thought was not furnished by Hans. He has served to weaken rather than strengthen the position of these enthusiasts. But we must generalize this negative conclusion of ours with care, for Hans cannot without further qualification be regarded as normal. Hans is a domesticated animal. It is possible, though the opposite is usually assumed, that our animals have suffered in the development of their mental life as a result of the process of domestication. To be sure, in some respects they have become more specialized than their wild kin, e.g. our hunting dogs, and in their habits they have become adapted largely to suit our needs. This latter is shown by all the anecdotes concerning clever dogs, horses, etc. But with the loss of their freedom they have also gradually been deprived of the urgent need of self-preservation and of the preservation of their species, and thus lack one of the greatest forces that make for psychic development. And often their artificial selection in culture has been with a view to the development of muscle and sinew, fat and wool, all at the expense of brain development. Footnote: Buffon, the great naturalist, expresses himself not less pessimistically in his own brilliant manner. Un animal domestique est un esclave dont on s'amuse, dont on se sert, dont on abuse, qu'on altère, qu'on dépayse et qu'on l'on dénature. End of footnotes. Our horses are, as a rule, sentenced to an especially dull mode of life, chained in stalls, and usually dark stalls at that, during 3/4 of their lives, and more than any other domestic animal, enslaved for thousands of years by reins and whip, they have become estranged from their natural impulses, and owing to continued confinement they may perhaps have suffered even in their sensory life. A gregarious animal, yet kept constantly in isolation, intended by nature to range over vast areas, yet confined to his narrow courtyard, and deprived of opportunity for sexual activity, he has been forced by a process of education to develop along lines quite opposite to his natural characteristics. Nevertheless, I believe that it is very doubtful if it would have been possible by any other methods even to call forth in the horse the ability to think. Presumably, however, it might be possible, under conditions and with methods of instruction more in accord with the life needs of the horse, to awaken in a fuller measure those mental activities which would be called into play to meet those needs. Though our investigations do not give support to the fantastic accounts of animal intelligence given by Brems, they by no means warrant a return to Descartes and his theory of the animal machine, as is advocated by a number of overcritical investigators. We cannot deny the validity of conclusions from analogy without denying at the same time the possibility of an animal psychology, indeed of all psychology. And all such conclusions indicate that the lower forms possess the power of sense perception, that they, like us, presumably have at their disposal certain images, and that their psychic life is to a large extent also constituted of mere image associations, and that they too learn by experience. Also that they are susceptible to feelings of pleasure and of pain, and also to emotions as jealousy, fear, etc., though these may be only of the kind which have a direct relation to their life needs. we are in no position to deny a priori the possibility of traces of conceptual thought in those forms nearest man in the scale, whether living in their natural manner or under artificial conditions, and even less so since the final word has not yet been spoken regarding the nature of conceptual thinking itself. All that is certain is that nothing of the kind has been proven to occur in the lower forms, and that as yet not even a suitable method of discovering its existence has been suggested. But the community of those elementary processes of mental life which we have mentioned above is in itself enough to connect the life of the lower forms with ours, and imposes upon us the duty of regarding them not as objects of exploitation and mistreatment, but as worthy of rational care and affection. End of section 11. Section 12. Supplements. Supplement 1. Mr. von Osten's Method of Instruction by C. Stumpf. The following is a report of the account which Mr. von Osten gave Professor Schumann and me of the method which he had used in the instruction of the horse, and which was illustrated by actual demonstrations. I cannot testify, of course, that Mr. von Osten really did adhere to this method throughout the 4 years in which he tutored the horse, but I will say that I have several good reasons for believing that it was impossible for him to have trumped up this make-believe scheme afterward merely to mislead us. Among the reasons are the following. He was always ready to give a detailed explanation of any question which we might interpose. The written statements of Major von Keller, who has known Mr. von Osten for a period of 15 years, the testimony of General Zobel, who became acquainted with the whole process fully a year before any public exhibitions were given, the accounts given by the tenants in Mr. von Osten's house, who for years saw the process of instruction going on in the courtyard of the apartment building. According to their accounts, his intercourse with the horse was like that with a child at school. He made much use of the apparatus, and never did they notice anything like an habituation to respond to certain signals. And finally, the appearance of the apparatus itself, some of which could not be bought at second hand, was most convincing. The apparatus used for the work in arithmetic consisted mainly of a set of large wooden pins, a set of smaller ones, such as are to be had in toy shops, a counting machine, such as is commonly used in the schools, a chart upon which were pasted the numbers from 1 to 100, and finally the digits, cut large and in brass and suspended from a string. For the work in reading, Mr. von Osten used the chart shown in the frontispiece of this book. Here we have the letters of the alphabet in small German script, with numbers written below which serve to indicate the row and what place in that row the letters occupy. For tones, a small child's organ was used, with the diatonic scale C1 to C2, and for instruction in colours, a number of coloured cloths were used. The work in arithmetic began by placing a single wooden pin in front of Hans, then commanding him, "Raise the foot, 1." Here we must assume that the horse had learned to respond to the command to raise the foot during the preceding period, when tapping in general had been taught. In order to get the horse to learn that he was to give only 1 tap, Mr. von Osten tried to control the tapping by means of holding the animal's foot, just as a teacher tries to aid a pupil in learning to write by guiding his hand. He repeated this exercise so often that finally the single tap was made, and always the right foot was insisted upon. Bread and carrots were the constant rewards. 2 of the pins were now set up, and the command was given, "Raise the foot, 1, 2." Mr. von Osten again aided the establishment of the proper association by using his hand as before. At the same time the 2 pins were pointed out, and the order was always without exception from left to right. Gradually it became unnecessary to touch the foot or to point to the pins, and instead the question was introduced, "How many are there?" in order that the horse should be accustomed to these words as an invitation to give the taps when he saw the wooden pins before him. Then 3 pins were taken, and the words 1, 2, 3 were spoken, and so on. In naming a number, the preceding ones were always named along with it, in order that the normal order might thus be learned at the same time. Later, the number alone, without the preceding ones, sufficed to elicit the proper number of taps. The last word of the series thus became characteristic of the series as a whole. It differs from all the others, and thus becomes the sign for the whole series of numbers thus named. each of which arises as a memory image at the proper place in the series and is accompanied by a tap of the foot. Thus Mr. von Osten at any rate had accounted to himself for this success. But Hans was not to acquire merely this relatively mechanical process of counting, hardly to be called counting, but he was to acquire also some meaning content for the number terms. For this purpose everything depended upon the concept "and." Only he who can grasp its meaning will be able to understand a number. 2 is 1 and 1. 3 is 2 and 1. Mr. von Osten had someone hold a large cloth before the horse, where the wooden pins usually were placed. He then had the cloth taken up and would pronounce emphatically the word "and." After this had been done a number of times, he put 2 of the pins and obscured them by the cloth. The cloth was again raised and the word "and" pronounced. Then Hans, as a result of his previous instruction, so Mr. von Osten thought, would give 2 taps at the side of the pins. The thing was repeated with 3 pins, then with 1, and so on, and the horse would always execute the proper number of taps. Now 5 pins were set up, 3 to the right being covered by the cloth. The horse tapped twice, and Mr. von Osten said 2. The cloth was then raised. Hans gave 3 further taps, and Mr. von Osten said "and 3" with emphasis. In this simple manner he tried to get the horse to understand that the 3 belongs to the 2, and that both together make 5. The image of the 5 pins, as it was known from previous experience, was to be associated with the combined groups of 2 and 3, and conversely, it was to be reproduced when these groups were presented. Later the cloth and pins were omitted, and the horse was asked, "How much is 2 and 3?" The horse tapped 5 times. It had learned how to add. Still, this could be regarded only as a mechanical process, if the horse were able to add only those numbers which had been presented together one or more times in the manner just described. And so long as we remained within the first decade, we could get 25 binary combinations whose sum does not exceed 10. Counting inverted orders, we would have 45 binary permutations, all of which might have been practiced separately. But as a matter of fact, Mr. von Osten did not take this course, for as he himself says, he allowed Hans to discover a great deal for himself. Hans had to develop the multiplication table for himself. With larger numbers and more addends, the number of combinations becomes so great that there can be no doubt that they were not practiced separately. Since, after all this preliminary instruction, Hans really began to give solutions of new problems, the master believed that this was proof that he had succeeded in inculcating the inner meaning of the number concepts, and not merely an external association of memory images with certain movement responses. But he always remained within the sphere of the ideas thus developed, and adhered closely to the customary vocabulary and its usage. Every new concept, each additional word, was explained anew. It would not be legitimate to condemn the whole procedure from the very beginning on the ground of the horse's lack of knowledge of language or of its use. It was Mr. von Osten's aim to convey to the horse an understanding of the language by means of sense presentations, adequate to give rise to the proper sense perceptions. Helen Keller and other blind deaf-mutes have been educated to an understanding of the language without the aid of vision and hearing. They have come to it through the sense of touch alone. Everything depends on whether or not the predisposition for it is present, and it was quite rational that Mr. von Osten should have chosen counting and arithmetic calculation as the processes by which to make his attack upon the animal mind, for as a matter of fact, nowhere else is it so easy to bridge the gap between perception and conception, and nowhere else can the sign of success or failure be perceived so readily as in the handling of numbers. It is unfortunate, however, that he did not utilize these same signs for purposes of counter-testing also, as, for instance, by inquiring for the cube root of 729. But he was prevented from doing this by his close adherence to his pedagogical principle, and by his unquestioning faith in the soundness of the entire procedure. In teaching multiplication, the counting machine was used. 2 of the 10 balls on one of the rods were pushed far to the left, thus, ball, ball. How many are there? 2 taps. Very well, that is once 2. Another group of 2 was pushed to the left, at a short interval from the first one, thus ball, 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 ball. How many times 2 balls are there, was asked, with a decided movement of the hand towards the 2 groups, 2 taps. How many, therefore, are 2 times 2? 4 taps. The horse was supposed to learn the meaning of the word times by means of the spatial separation of the groups. He was to be taught to notice and to count the groups, and also the number of units in a single group. 3 times 2 then meant 3 groups with 2 units in each group. The horse was supposedly aided by the following factors: the relative nearness of the units belonging to one group as over against the space interval between the groups themselves, also that the groups were pointed out as wholes in connection with the emphatic enunciation of the words once, twice, etc., and finally the touching and raising of the horse's foot by means of the hand until all the desired associations of the idea with one another and with the corresponding tapping movements were quite perfect. Subtraction was taught in the following manner. 5 pins were set up. The horse tapped 5 times. Mr. von Osten then removed 2 of them and said emphatically, "I take away minus. How many are still standing?" The horse tapped 3 times. Here, too, there was at first some assistance by means of the hand to get the tapping. In division, 4 balls were pushed to the left end of the rod, thus ball, 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 ball. How many balls are there to the left? 4 taps. They were now divided into 2 pairs, thus ball, 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 ball. Pointing to the units of one group, the teacher asks, "There are always how many in the group?" 2 taps. 3 groups were formed, thus ball, 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 ball. There are now how many balls to the left? 6 taps. And there are always how many in each group? Pointing at them, 2 taps. And how often is 2 contained in 6? Pointing to the groups consecutively, 3 taps, etc. The ideas of part, of whole, and of being contained were illustrated by means of a chalk line, which was interrupted in one or more places by erasure. In all these operations Mr. von Osten adhered strictly to the rule, and required others to do so too, that the number upon which the operation was performed must be mentioned first. Thus, one was not to say, "Take 3 from 7, but "From 7 take away 3. Otherwise, he believed, Hans would become easily confused. Also, one was not allowed to say multiply, but to take a certain number so many times. He himself never departed from this practice. We will not go into the details of the method by which Hans was taught the meaning of the number signs, of the signs of operation, of the numbers above 10, or the significance of digits, tens, etc. Only this: when in problems in addition the sum was greater than 10, the 10 was first tapped, and then the remainder was the number added to the 10. Thus, you are to add 9 and 5. How much must you add to the 9 to have 10? 1 tap. But now you were to add not merely 1, but 5. How much do you still have to add to the 10? 4 taps. In like manner, when the addends were below 20 or 30, and the sum above 20 or 30, Mr. von Osten would ask for the 20 or 30 taps first. He thought that he was thus giving his pupil an ever firmer grasp upon the principle of the structure of our number system, in which all higher numbers are constituted of tens and digits. For the same reason he used at first, instead of the words 11 and 12, 11 and 12 in the German, expressions which in English might be rendered as 1-teen and 2-teen, einsen and zweisen in the German, and only later, after the animal had seemingly mastered the meaning in question, did Mr. von Osten replace them by the usual forms. All this was beautifully conceived and might perhaps form the basis of the instruction of primitive races, but it is of immediate interest for us only because it enables us to better understand the origin of the conviction under which Mr. von Osten and his followers laboured. Supplement 2. The Report of September 12, 1904. The undersigned came together for the purpose of investigating the question whether or not there is involved in the feats of the horse of Mr. von Osten anything of the nature of tricks, that is, intentional influence or aid on the part of the questioner. After a careful investigation, they are unanimously agreed that such signs are out of the question under the conditions which were maintained during this investigation. This decision in no wise takes into account the character of the men exhibiting the horse, and who are known to most of the undersigned. In spite of the most attentive observation, nothing in the way of movements or other forms of expression which might have served as a sign could be discovered. In order to obviate involuntary movements on the part of those present, one series of tests was made with only Mr. Bush present. Among these tests were some in which, according to his professional judgment, the possibility of tricks of the sort commonly used in training was excluded. Another series of tests was made in such a way that the correct answers to the questions which Mr. Van Osten put to the horse were unknown to the questioner. From previous observation, the greater number of the undersigned also know of a large number of cases in which, during the absence of Mr. Van Osten and Mr. Shillings, other persons were likewise able to obtain correct responses from the horse. Among these were some cases in which the questioner did not know the correct solution of the problem or was mistaken about it. And lastly, several of the undersigned have become acquainted with the methods which Mr. Van Osten used, which has little in common with methods of training, and is patterned after the instruction given in the elementary schools. As a result of these observations, the undersigned are of the opinion that the unintentional signs of the kind which are at present familiar are likewise excluded. They are unanimously agreed that this much is certain. This is a case which appears in principle to differ from any hitherto discovered, and has nothing in common with training, in the usual sense of the word, and therefore is worthy of a serious and incisive investigation. Berlin, September 12, 1904. Paul Bush, circus manager. Otto, Kanzlkastell Rutenhausen. Dr. A. Grabau, member of the school board, retired. Robert Rahn, teacher, municipal schools. Dr. Ludwig Heck, director of the zoological garden. Dr. Oskar Heinroth, assistant in the Berlin Zoological Garden. Dr. Richard Kant. Major F. W. von Keller, retired. Major General T. H. Köring, retired. Dr. Meissner, assistant in the Royal Veterinary College. Professor Nagel, head of the Department of Sense Physiology in the Physiological Institute of the University of Berlin. Professor C. Stumpf, director of the Psychological Institute, member of the Academy of Sciences. Henry Suermont. Supplement 3. An abstract from the records of the September Commission. Footnote. A few days after the 12th of September I made the present abstract from the original records of the Commission, which I have here abbreviated somewhat. See page 8. Referring once more to the misunderstanding mentioned on page 3, I would say that the closing sentence of the report is here re-given literally as it then appeared. See Stumpf. End of footnote. The important meetings occurred on the 11th and 12th of September, and both of them extended over 4 hours. The greatest difficulty was occasioned by the condition laid down by Mr. Van Osten, that we were to work without him from the very beginning. In a certain sense this condition had been met once before when Mr. Shillings appeared upon the scene, a man whose fairness ought to be doubted by none. He came utterly sceptical, and yet in the course of a week he learned to handle the horse and received responses regularly. However, since the public had begun to doubt Mr. Shillings also, another person had to attempt the role of questioner. Count Zucastel tried to do this and practised for some days before the meetings, but his success, although no small moment, was not great enough to be convincing. In apprising Mr. Van Osten of this fact, we caused a veritable catastrophe. He declared in a most decisive manner that he would have to insist upon the condition that he had imposed, since the public demanded it, and he could never assist in any tests until he had been cleared of the suspicion of having descended to the use of tricks. If it should take weeks to accustom the horse to a new questioner, then there would be no alternative but to wait that length of time. A happy circumstance helped us out of our difficulty. We had chanced in our discussion to mention the experience of Dr. Meissner, a member of the Commission, who on the day before had gone to witness an exhibition of the mare Clever Rosa, and who believed that he had succeeded in discovering the tricks involved. There was a sudden change in Mr. Van Osten's attitude. He expressed his willingness to undergo the most stringent examination, and agreed to anything in the way of conditions of control, challenging even the proven ability of Dr. Meissner. I have neither whip nor rod, as had the man in the exhibition, and agree to any precautionary measures you may care to take. After he had gone, the Commission decided to ask him to have the horse perform one of the more common, simple feats. They were going to watch him very closely. Different members were assigned the task of attending to different parts of his body: head, eyes, right hand, left hand, etc. While Mr. Bush, since he was the most proficient in the detection of tricks, was to regard the total behaviour of the man. The exhibitions included the indication of the day of the week by means of taps, the day just past, the day ahead, its date, arithmetical problems, and the counting of rings strung upon a rod. Messrs. Grabo and Rahn interpolated a few tests themselves, in which they did the questioning. All tests were successful. Mr. Van Osten withdrew, and in comparison of notes which followed, Mr. Bush, as well as all the others, declared that they had discovered nothing of the nature of a visible sign. Mr. Bush said that he had also kept an eye on the spectators, and had noticed nothing there. Nevertheless, he desired to see Mr. Van Osten go through one series with no one else but himself, Bush, present. This was done, and on this occasion a number of tests were made in the recognition of coloured cloths. The horse was required to indicate, by tapping, the place in the series which the cloth occupied, and was then asked to bring the green or the red, as the case might be, in his mouth. Furthermore, he was asked to approach that one of the 5 gentlemen standing at a distance whose photograph had been shown him. Then he was requested to spell the words rat and bush according to the methods which he had been taught. Nearly all these tests were likewise successful. In the conference which followed, Mr. Bush again declared that he had noticed no trace of a sign. He maintained that in the selection of coloured cloths, especially when they were placed so closely together, and in the approach towards a person, there was no possibility whatever that some trick was being used. During the session of December 12th, Mr. Van Osten agreed to 2 sets of experiments. 1. Another man was to put the question to the horse. Mr. Van Osten himself was to stand back to the questioner and to bend forward, so that he was effectually hidden from the horse's view, yet could, by means of occasional calls, make his presence known to the animal. The assumption was that it would be conducive to success if the horse knew that the master was present and was awaiting the answer, yet at the same time the possibility of receiving a sign was obviated. 2. Another man in Mr. Van Osten's absence was to ask the horse to tap a certain number. Then the questioner was to leave, and Mr. Van Osten, returning, was to ask the horse to perform some arithmetic process with the number which was thus unknown to the master. Mr. Van Osten said that he thought that this method was somewhat risky, since the horse would be aware that he, Mr. Van Osten, would not know the number, and might therefore be in a humour to play some prank. The questions of the first sort were answered with but very few errors. Mr. Hahn and Count du Castel asked simple questions in arithmetic. When Mr. Van Osten withdrew into the stable, the Count put several other problems, among them the counting of persons and of windows, all of which were solved correctly. Between the first and second series of tests, the following experiments were interpolated. The names of 6 members of the Commission were written upon 6 slates respectively, which were then suspended from a string. Mr. Van Osten pointed to one of the men and asked, "On which of the slates is this gentleman's name to be found?" The correct answer was tapped in every case. The command to approach the slate in question was also obeyed as a rule, though this was not as uniformly successful as tapping. In the conference which followed, Mr. Bush declared that the feats appeared inconceivable to him, and again none of the men had noted anything in the way of signs. Now followed the second series of tests mentioned above. In order to be sure to get the correct responses, Mr. Shillings, who up to this point had not been present at any of the experiments, was asked to put the questions to the horse. Mr. Van Osten went into the house, accompanied by a member of the Commission, and again Mr. Shillings would go out before the second part of the test, without having met Mr. Van Osten. 5 tests were made in this way. They were not attended by such amazing success as were the preceding ones, but nevertheless the results were surprising. The horse nearly always repeated the number itself instead of performing the operation required. Since, however, Mr. Shillings, owing to a misunderstanding, had, in the first 2 cases, said to the horse, "You are to repeat this number for Mr. Van Osten," the errors might appear to be a result of this request. At the final discussion, the result of which was the unanimous declaration which was given for publication, not only the data obtained between these 2 sessions, but also the earlier experiences of some of the members of the Commission were taken into consideration. none of the tests witnessed could be referred to chance or to the use of tricks. Count Castell pointed out that in the course of 8 days he had elicited 40 correct responses from the horse, among them some in regard to which he himself had been momentarily in error. Other members recalled the many instances in previous exhibitions during which both Mr. Schillings and Mr. von Osten were absent, when questions were put to the horse by others. The Commission also had access to a detailed account written by Professor Stumpf on Mr. von Osten's method of instruction, based on the explanations and demonstrations which Mr. von Osten had himself given. As a result of these considerations, the Commission felt under obligations to give public expression to its conviction. In the report, it limited itself, however, to the purely negative side, principally in denying the use of tricks, and expressed no opinion with regard to the actual genesis of the horse's accomplishments, since it believed that there was greater possibility that other factors were involved which ought to be carefully investigated. Supplement 4. The report of December 9th, 1904. Together with Dr. E. von Hornbostel and Mr. O. Pfungst, I have tried during the past few weeks to find an explanation of the accomplishments of the horse Hans by the experimental method. We had access to the horse in the absence of the master and groom. The results are as follows. The horse failed in his responses whenever the solution of the problem that was given him was unknown to any of those present. For instance, when a written number or the objects to be counted were placed before the horse, but were invisible to everyone else, and especially to the questioner, he failed to respond properly. Therefore, he can neither count, nor read, nor solve problems in arithmetic. The horse failed again whenever he was prevented by means of sufficiently large blinders from seeing the persons, and especially the questioner, to whom the solution was known. He therefore required some sort of visual aid. These aids need not, however, and this is the peculiarly interesting feature in the case, be given intentionally. The proof of this is found in the fact that in the absence of Mr. von Osten, the horse gave correct replies to a large number of persons, and to be more specific, Mr. Schillings and later Mr. Pfungst, after working with the horse for a short time, regularly received correct answers without their being in any way conscious of having given any kind of signal. So far as I can see, the following explanation is the only one that will comport with these facts. The horse must have learned, in the course of the long period of problem solving, to attend ever more closely, while tapping, to the slight changes in bodily posture with which the master unconsciously accompanied the steps in his own thought processes, and to use these as closing signals. The motive for this direction and straining of attention was the regular reward in the form of carrots and bread which attended it. This unexpected kind of independent activity and the certainty and precision of the perception of minimal movements thus attained are astounding in the highest degree. The movements which call forth the horse's reaction are so extremely slight in the case of Mr. von Osten that it is easily comprehensible how it was possible that they should escape the notice even of practised observers. Mr. Pfungst, however, whose previous laboratory experience had made him keen to the perception of visual stimuli of slightest duration and extent, succeeded in recognizing in Mr. von Osten the different kinds of movement which were the basis of the various accomplishments of the horse. Furthermore, he succeeded in controlling his own movements, of which he had hitherto been unconscious, in the presence of the horse, and finally became so proficient that he could replace these unintentional movements with intentional ones. He can now call forth at will all the various reactions of the horse by making the proper kind of voluntary movements, without asking the relevant question or giving any sort of command. But Mr. Pfungst meets with the same success when he does not attend to the movements to be made, but rather focuses as intently as possible upon the number desired, since in that case the necessary movement occurs whether he wills it or not. In the near future he will give a special detailed report of his observations, which gives promise of becoming a valuable contribution to the study of involuntary movements. Also, he will give an account of our tests and of the mechanism of the various accomplishments of the horse. We must also defer, until then, the disproof of certain seemingly relevant arguments in favour of the horse's power of independent thought. Some defenders of the view which maintains the horse's rationality may urge that it was only through our experiments that the animal became trained and spoiled in so far as the ability to think is concerned. They are refuted in this, however, by the fact that the horse still continues to solve problems involving decimal fractions and to determine calendar dates for Mr. von Osten as brilliantly as ever, as is shown by his recent demonstration before a large group of spectators. That these results are now being achieved in a manner essentially different from formerly is nothing but a bare assertion. On the other hand, now that the possibility has been established that these wonderful results may be obtained in all their complexity by means of intentional signs, many will question whether Mr. von Osten did not himself train the horse from the very beginning to respond to these signs. No one has the right, however, to charge an old man who has never had a blemish on his reputation with having invented a most refined network of lies, if the facts can be explained in a satisfactory manner in some other rational way. And this can be done in this case, for we have seen that there is another alternative, other than the theory that the horse can think or the assumption that tricks have been employed. And now, aside from the specific results obtained, what is the scientific and philosophic import of the whole affair? For one thing, the revolution in our conception of the animal mind, which had been hoped for by some and feared by others, has not taken place. But a conclusion of the opposite character is justified. If such unexampled patience and high pedagogical excellence as was brought to bear by Mr. von Osten during the course of 4 long years could not bring to light the slightest trace of conceptual thinking, then the old assertion of the philosophers that the lower forms are incapable of such thinking finds corroboration in the results of these experiments so far as the animal scale up to and including the ungulates is concerned. For this reason, the tremendous effort put forth by Mr. von Osten is not, in spite of the self-deception under which he labours, lost to science. If anyone has the courage to try the experiment with the dog or the ape, the insight which we have now gained will enable him to beware of one source of error which hitherto has not been noticed. In the face of much misapprehension which has arisen, I wish once more to say emphatically that the Committee of September 12th in no wise declared itself to be convinced that the horse had the power of rational thinking. The committee restricted itself entirely to the question whether or not tricks were involved, and intentionally and rightly referred the positive investigation to a purely scientific court. I would also report that for some time Mr. Schillings has been convinced by his own observations of the horse's lack of reason, and when he was apprised of our conclusion in the matter, he embraced it without wavering. I have no intention of taking part in any discussion which might arise in the press as a result of the present report. Unless they wish to confine themselves to mere guesswork, the defenders of other views will not shrink from the task of basing their criticism upon careful methodical experimentation, and they will keep a detailed record of their results day by day, for statements based solely upon memory, without specific reporting of experimental conditions, prove nothing. Professor Carl Stumpf, December 9th, 1904. End of section 12. End of Clever Hans. The Horse of Mr. von Osten by Oskar Pfungst, translated by Carl Leo Rahn.